Hello, dear brothers and sisters. We're going to start our Bible study. We are speaking about Mark's Gospel, and we are on chapter 9, chapter 9, verses 30 to 38, all the way to 44. Let's read the text again. We talked about it yesterday morning a little bit, and we're going to start again today. Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. For he taught his disciples and said to them, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise the third day. But they did not understand this saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? But they kept silent, for the road they had disputed among themselves who would be greatest. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now John answered him, saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us. But Jesus said, do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, surely I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed rather than having two hands go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame rather than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where the worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. For everyone will be seasoned with fire, and every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. This is a very long passage. I will quickly go over it. And he tells them about his resurrection, and unfortunately, they do not believe it, though they cannot understand it. So we already talked about this quite extensively, why they wouldn't understand, why they could not comprehend the way that he was talking about his resurrection. Did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. We talked about fear also, that it is because of their relationship being incomplete, and that also that they were talking about themselves among themselves about their uh, being first or second or the greatest. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, they asked him, he asked them, what was if it you disputed among yourselves on the road? So this was the discussion that they had, and that's the reason we talked about it, that they could not help the man with the sick boy because their mind, their heart was not with God, was not with Christ, but rather was with themselves. We talked about the fact that we can be self centered, we can be other centered, or we can be God centered. And that is in this case, the disciples are self centered because they're trying to figure out their relationship, uh, their place in front of God rather than uh, God's place in their heart. That's a very important concept. We don't look at God and see where we are in His kingdom, but rather we should be looking for His kingdom in our heart. Invite His kingdom into our heart. And they kept silent. Obviously, it's like children when they get caught from when they're doing something they were not supposed to be doing, they just stay silent. For on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. It's very interesting that when we do something, while we're doing it, we know that it's wrong, but we still do it until we get caught. And then when we are asked that why were you doing this, then we find all the excuses. We explain it, that this was the reason, that was the reason I was doing this, I was feeling this way, and so on and so forth. But the reason that they uh, keep silent is that they know exactly what they have done wrong. And they knew it from the beginning, as everyone else. When we do something wrong, we know it's wrong. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. So we are talking about now other centeredness. Our God centeredness comes from other centeredness. We need to learn through our relationship with others how to serve God. If we cannot serve other people, forget about serving God. We can pretend we're serving God. We can desire to serve God, but it comes through serving others. And other means anyone who is around us, anyone who comes in contact with us, anyone who God has who has been put by God into our lives. Sometimes we write off people and we pretend they don't exist, and we create our clique, and we are serving one another in that small group, where Christ here is talking about uh, the wider circle. And we will see in a second how that's true. Uh, so we shall serve one another. In order to serve someone else, our ego has to deplete, it has to go down, because otherwise we will be constantly thinking of ourselves. This is very important to remember, that serving others can also serve us. So when we serve others for the sake of our own uh, benefit, to show people that, well, by the way, we're doing this, or to show God that we're doing this so that we can gain some reward, then it is not necessarily the best thing. They say that pride, which is ultimately the ego, hides even in humility. So someone acting as humble can be acting out of their pride. And that's what Christ is trying to eliminate, because that's the original sin. The pride, the ego is the original sin. Sometimes people take it very lightly. My ego, I have a big ego, and so on and so forth. That happens especially with people with a lot of success. Their ego grows so big that they when they walk around they don't see people, and uh, that is the original sin. We need to be very careful with it. That's the sin of the devil, and that we have inherited from the devil. And by exercising, by feeding our egos, me first mentality is bringing us closer to the devil, and that there's no doubt that we will fall like the devil did. In the liturgy, into the history of the into in the literature of the fathers, written by the fathers, it's very clearly explained that the devil fell because the devil was standing in front of God, was the most luminous angel, and because of the pride, thinking that the light comes out of himself, not from God, in reality it was just reflecting God's light. The devil fell in the result of this prideful, egocentric position and thought. And that is also given to humanity in the Garden of Eden, where the devil says to them that you will be like gods. So uh, when we succeed in our life tremendously, sometimes we go to a point where we feel like we are in charge of everything, and we get to even to that point where we think we are God. And there are people in the world who have declared to themselves to be gods. Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. So Christ here is reversing totally, completely the pyramid. Whoever is in the bottom, mostly it's children. We sometimes even leave them out of attention and we don't pay attention to them. We don't listen to their ideas, or we do not imitate their way of relating to one another and God. Now, in nowadays, children sometimes can be raised in such an egocentric way that even children aren't anymore the best example. But if you want, you can go as far as looking at an infant who totally, completely depends on a mother, and it's the most innocent uh, stage of life. In this case, Christ looks at the best example, the example of a child who has not grown to fill his or her heart with all the desires and emotions and pride and other vices, uh, their hearts. And he says that we need to become like these children. It is very interesting that we have sometimes we turn the churches into adult clubs, and children are in the back pew or outside or in the narthex, where the church, Christ says, it belongs to these children, that whoever does something for these children is doing to him. So in the sense, the children should be the front pew in the church, even in the solea, so that people can look at them and learn from them, because it is them who Christ says are the example of him. Now we can have children who are very bad behaved. They have already from very young age learned uh, behaviors of the adults. Remember, the children are not born that way. Everything they know, they learn from us. And that's what we can see sometimes in young children. That has to be corrected. Now John answered him, saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us. Dear brothers and sisters, you probably have noticed that the Christian church is an open ended church. The Christian church is, I don't want to call it religion, but if you call it with that title, it is a open ended religion that everyone is welcome in any time, in any form or any shape. And that makes the Christian church grow. Sometimes, however, the churches can become cultish. What is the definition or description of a cult? The cult forms around a center figure, a person who is charismatic, usually, maybe even has some great virtues, and when that happens, the cult closes its circle. It becomes a group of people who imitate that one central figure and circle around that person. And because they want to see immediate results, they start growing to become like that person. And then anyone else who comes in isn't welcome. That same exact thing can happen from a cultural perspective. We have many national churches that are closed off. And if you don't belong to that particular nation, you can't break that invisible barrier to get in. Even when you get in, you stay in the peripheries. You stay, you're a second class member of the club because you do not fulfill all the requirements. You come short of one thing. You do not belong to that particular ethnicity, and that is a uh, earlier centuries. It was called Philitism. It was a heresy in the church, Philitism, that created national groups. And today, the Philitism doesn't exist as it is in its full power, but we still can exercise such behaviors that in an indirect way we can push other ethnicities out of ethnic churches. Well, let them go and create their own church. That's not how the church operated in the early centuries. We see even similar conversation between Paul and Peter, where Peter was insisting that everyone who becomes Christian, they should go through circumcision, become Jews first, then become Christians. And Paul, discussing this in the first council of the apostles, explains and kind of makes the point that the Gentiles, the Greeks and others, Romans, don't have to go through that to be followers of Christ. Today, however, we have fallen back into that sin, and we sometimes demand from people to first become so familiar to our ethnicity, then they can practice their Christianity. And that's partially because our ethnicity and our Christianity are kind of intertwined. But we cannot demand from other people to also take the ethnical part of our identity. What did Christianity do in the first centuries, all the way up to 12, 13, 14, 15 centuries? It did go into different nations and brought pure Christianity to them. Probably brought some elements of their ethnicities from wherever the uh, missionary individuals came. But what it did, it actually, these missionaries went to that particular country and they lived in that country and they actually adopted their ethnic cultural identity to themselves. They lived like these pagan people, as far as it was not concerning their beliefs. Then, by learning their ethnical identity, they transformed. By converting these people to Christianity, they shaped their uh, existing culture and ethnic and national identity in the image of Christianity. And that's how we have all these ethnic churches that have all their flavor, their nuances. They have not lost from being Bulgarian, Romanian. They have not lost being Russian. They have not lost being Greek, uh, although everything came from Judaism. However, we see some Jewish elements in every Christian Orthodox church of different ethnicities, but they also have their own unique ethnic character. And that is true for every single person. Imagine if someone helped you to become Christian and they imposed on you also their personal habits and behaviors and their calendars on you, that you have to follow their calendar, everything that they do in their daily life. Instead, what we should do, what we ought to do, is to bring people to Christ and allow them to shape their personality in the image of Christ. And then that would determine whether or not they act one way or the other. There is common thread between all Christians, and there is uniqueness about every Christian. And in this story here, we see that even very in the very first stage of the relationship between Christ and humanity, when it was just between him and his 12 disciples and other disciples that he had, we see that cultish mentality in the disciples, that it is this closed circle of 12 people who are following you, that everybody, if they want to be with us, they have to join us and they have to go under our rule. Christ, however, says that his way is much broader, that people do not have to become club members, they don't have to become uh, close knit circle members and behave exactly the same way that all these members are behaving to belong to him or to work on behalf of him. And he says, do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterward speak evil of me. This is a very important point here. John comes to Christ and he brings an example of a person who is performing miracles in the name of Christ. Don't forget that just few days ago they could not perform a miracle in his name. The closest centrism, that they were disputing among themselves who is the greatest. So they were centered on themselves, and they and all now not only egocentrism but jealousy creeps in, because now they see someone else who does not belong to this group who are closest to Christ performing miracles in Christ's name. So there is someone out there who is greater than them, and they were disputing among themselves who is the greatest. So that's causing the problem, because when we are in charge, we want to be fully in charge. We fail or we succeed, it doesn't matter. But then, if someone else is doing anything a little slightly greater than us, then we shut them down. We destroy them so that we are the greatest. And sometimes people rise on the corpses of the others. And that is very true in politics. That is very true in even normal business life. And that can be true also in church reality. That in order to rise, sometimes people destroy others so that they can shine. You blow off other people's torches so that your candle can be shining, it can be visible, viewable. Instead of making your fire bigger, we turn the fire of the others down, and that's why we fall into the mediocrity, that we do not tolerate anyone who is great, because they cast a shadow on us, and that's why we destroy them. And that's what Christ forbade to his disciples from doing. Do not stop them. You do not have to stop someone who's making miracles to look good. You just grow to be able to perform miracles yourself. Fasting and prayer is the way, he said to them earlier, to grow and get rid of that dispute among yourselves, so that you can also be centered and with me. For he who is not against us is on our side. That's such a strong statement. In some organizations, leaders demand that people are uh, very loyal to the leader. If you are not loyal to the leader, forget about you. You will be destroyed. And sometimes that causes organizations go down. And it can be in politics, it can be in businesses, it can be even in the church. Loyalty is what creates the cult of the few. And in this case, Christ is reversing that. They don't have to be with you. All they have to be is not against you. And you need to recognize and respect their greatness, because they may be doing great work for Christ. And if you destroy them, you will destroy ultimately yourself, because, like Nicodemus says to the Jews when they were punishing the Christians, he said to them, if they are from God and you destroy them, you better watch out. If they are not from God, just leave them alone and they will disappear. But the fear did not allow them to act in that very clear minded way, clear hearted way. They were not great themselves, so they had so much insecurity in them, that when they were seeing the disciples of Christ doing great things, in order to shine their own small, tiny light, they tried to extinguish the light of the disciples. And that's what Nicodemus was warning them, that if you fight this light, it may be the light of God, and you may not be able to extinguish it. And that's what exactly happened. They were unable to extinguish the fire that comes from God. The Holy Spirit was leading them, and therefore there was no way they could stop this fire from spreading. In Israel, whatever the Israelites tried mistakenly by uh, attempting to put down the light of the disciples can also happen inside of our church communities, where one group can destroy another group, one individual can destroy another individual, just to make sure that they are greatest. And the dispute is about that, what the disciples have. So we need to be careful from all this. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, surely I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. So he's saying that people who give you a cup of water in my name, they will have a reward. But that depends on whether or not these disciples belonged to Christ, because he clearly identifies that. And he says, because you belong to Christ. So sometimes we demand service and we think that people serving us will get rewarded. But it is not us that becomes the reason for the reward for other people who serve, but if that service is directed to Christ. And if we are egocentric, the service that we receive, the cup of water that we receive, it ends with us and it never becomes service to God. These people who are serving without the knowledge, they may still get rewarded, but we need to know that in order to make the sacrifice of the others to the church, the community has to be Christ centered. So anyone who makes sacrifices and gives things to the church has to take and bring it to Christ. It has to be Christ centered. It cannot be self centered. It cannot end with the club. It's not a membership to the club that people bring to. It's a stewardship to Christ that they pay to. And if that doesn't work, it doesn't work. Surely I say to you, he will by no means lose their reward. And whoever serves in this way, whoever brings their rewards to their gifts to Christ, they will be rewarded. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a milestone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. I'm going to end here. I'll start tonight from this point that children are the example of the disciples, that Christ is talking about his disciples as that they should be like children. And that's the basic definition of the disciples. Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, now and forever, to the ages of ages. Amen. Thank you, and I will see you tonight at 7 o'clock.